It started on a morning, so still even the lake seemed to be holding its breath. The mist hovered low over the water, soft as linen, and the only sound was the gentle creak of my old dock, swaying in rhythm with the ripples. I built that dock with my own hands 12 years ago, back when I thought peace was something you could buy with a piece of land that I moved here after years in the city. I traded streetlights for starlight, traffic for loons, and the occasional coyote cry. Every sunrise felt like forgiveness. My wife Ellen used to say the lake made me younger. Even after she passed, I kept the place exactly how she loved it. The floor beds neat, the porch light warm, and the wooden fence that marked our boundary polished like a promise. That fence meant something to me. Not just wood and nails. It was the line between solitude and intrusion, between my world and theirs. For over a decade, nobody crossed it until the HOA came. Our neighborhood was run by a small, smug board of locals who called themselves the Lakeside Preservation Committee. It sounded noble. In truth, they were an HOA with more power than reason, the kind that thought every flower needed permission and every fence needed a vote. For years, I paid my dues, signed their forms, and stayed out of trouble. But that spring, everything changed. They said it was about community aesthetics. They said my fence, the same fence that had stood untouched for 12 years, was encroaching on shared shoreline property. When I read their letter, I laughed. My fence was built long before the HOA was formed. It had survey stakes approved by the county. It was not encroaching. It was protecting. But the letter was not a request. It was an order. You are hereby required to remove the fence along the eastern boundary of your property within 30 days, or face daily fines under Section 8.3 of the HOA compliance policy. They signed it with a smiley logo. I remember staring at that cheerful sun printed on the top corner, thinking they must be joking. They were not. Within a week, I started getting calls from a man named Dale Hensley, the HOA president. His voice had the kind of politeness that hides a blade. "We are all neighbors here, Tom. I am sure you understand the importance of maintaining harmony along the lakefront." That I told him I did. But harmony in my book did not mean erasing the boundary of my wife and Ibwil. That he laughed softly. "You know, it is funny. The family next door, the Marshalls, they have been wanting more access to the shoreline. Their kids love to fish. We thought it might be nice to open that arrow. A community dock, maybe." That is when it hit me. It was not about rules. It was about favoritism. The HOA was not trying to preserve aesthetics. They were trying to give my lakefront to their friends. The AT first, I tried to handle it the decent way. I pulled my land records, property deed, and even the original plat map from the county office. Every line, every coordinate proved one thing. The fence was entirely within my property. That I sent copies to Dale and the board, politely explaining that any removal would be a violation of my rights, not theirs. Their reply came 2 days later. A bright red notice stapled to my mailbox. "Failure to comply will result in fines of $250 per day starting immediately." That is when I realized this was not bureaucracy. This was war. Still, I did not lash out. Not yet. I watched. I listened. I attended their next meeting. The board sat behind a long wooden table, pretending to be official. Dale sat at the center, wearing that smug smile like a badge of authority. When I stood up to speak, the room went quiet. "You are trying to steal what is mine," I said plainly. "My land, my peace, my boundary. You will not get it." Dale leaned forward. "That IT is not personal, Tom. It is policy." Funny thing about policy, it can be rewritten. That night, I stood by my fence under the moonlight and made myself a promise. If they wanted to cross that line, I would make sure they never forgot what was on the other side. And if you are watching this right now, wondering how far an ordinary man will go to protect what is his, hit that like button. Because what happened next still does not feel real, even Tom. Spring turned into summer, and the lake warmed slow and steady. The Marshalls moved in 2 doors down. They had kids and a commotion of bikes and laughter. For a while, their presence felt like a bright spot. Children playing by the water is a good sound. Ellen used to say that too. But the gratitude was short-lived. Within a month, the Marshalls started asking at board meetings for more community access to the shoreline. Their requests landed like seeds in fertile ground. The Lakeside Preservation Committee watered them with polite nods and phrases about shared enjoyment and family-friendly spaces. They never once asked me. They never once considered that the fence I had kept up for 12 years was part of my life and memory. To them, the fence was an obstacle. To me, it was a promise I had made to my late wife. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of power tools. Men were measuring along the eastern boundary, where my fence met the grass. That a truck with the HOA logo sat on the road. That I walked out to find temporary markers and a group of volunteers laying down stones as the first step toward a new communal path. That I asked what they were doing. They looked at me with apologetic smiles and said the project had board approval. That I showed them my deed. They shrugged and returned to their work. When I asked Dale about permits, he grew quiet and said something about informal approval and community benefit. The word benefit tasted like ash in my mouth. That it was clear then that the marshals had influence. They attended every meeting. They hosted coffee mornings. They brought cookies to the volunteers and small laughs to the board. Favoritism is not loud. That it is patient and polite. Then one morning the fence was down. Not by my hand, not with my consent. The posts had been pulled, and the board stacked neatly by the road. A handwritten note lay on my porch. IT said we removed this to improve access for community US. No signature, no apology. That I put the boards back the same day. That I hammered them into the posts until my hands ached. That I watched the water and tried not to think about the way the shoreline felt when Ellen and I used to sit there. My neighbor waved across the yard. That I nodded and did not go over. The HOA began a campaign of small annoyances that grew into a pattern. They labeled my dock as unapproved. They claimed noise violations for early morning fishing. They sent notices that my landscaping disrupted community sight lines. Each letter landed like a pebble. Alone they seemed small. Together they made a slow landslide. The marshals invited neighbors for a picnic and then posted photos on the community page. The pictures there. Shoreline looked full and open. My name was not mentioned. The posts gathered likes and comments and a growing sense of inevitability. People began to imagine the lake as belonging to everyone. They forgot that belonging sometimes requires boundaries. I tried to reason with people. That I tried to speak softly at meetings. That I explained the surveys. That I showed maps and pointed to old stamps and signatures. That I was met with polite heads and sliding attention. The board spoke of unity. They used the words community and harmony as shields. When I pressed for a formal vote on the matter, they delayed and rearranged agendas until the topic lost momentum in administrative fog. Then the marshals moved a trailer onto the edge of the shared road. It blocked sight lines and carried equipment for the new dock. The kids played around it as if it had always been their point. One evening I watched the marshals and Dale walking the shoreline. They paced like men plotting a garden. I felt sick. Once the fence was down, they began to plant ornamental shrubs across what had been my boundary. Neighbors complimented the new greenery. They said it looked welcoming. No one asked who had paid for the plants. No one asked why the stone pillars the HOA had set up sat half on my meter line and half on their property. Why the time questions came. The shrubs had roots. Why the time complaints arrived. The path had start. There were confrontations, not big ones. Small things at first. A volunteer who insisted I move my barbecue because it blocked the community view. The notice that my outdoor lighting violated community nightscape policy. A complaint filed against me for leaving my trash bin by the curb on a non-designated day. It was harassment dressed in rules. I answered every claim with documents and polite refusals. I listened as they accused me of being standoffish and obstructive. They called me stubborn. They called me old-fashioned. The worst was how quickly some people turned away. Neighbors I had waved to for years nodded politely and closed their doors. The few avoided me at the grocery store. I felt small in a place that had once felt like home. There's a special loneliness in living next to a lake while being barred from its common stories. Night I sat on the bare post where the fence had been, and I thought about Ellen and about the vows we had made when we first built this place. Memory is a stubborn tenant. It lives in your porch light and in the exact place where a board meets a post. Each evening, I watched the marshal's children play by the water and tried to feel less like an intruder in my own life, that I tried the legal route, that I filed a complaint with the county, that I asked for mediation. The HOA responded with a letter pointing to a clause about historical use and community need. Their letter read like warmth. Their tone was designed to soothe that it was a soft enough paper barrier to stop nothing. Then the HOA filed a notice claiming that the shoreline was a shared amenity and that residents had historically accessed it. They attached photos of picnics and kayaks taken over a decade. They framed the images like proof that I recognized some of the faces, that I recognized my own empty chair in the background of a photo that had been cropped. They were making a history that fit their needs. The hearing was scheduled for a humid afternoon that I sat in the room and watched the board present testimonials and photos. People who had said hello to me in the street nodded and told the clerk how nice it would be to walk down to the water without fences. That I stood when they called my name, that I laid out the deed and the plat maps and the dates in black and white. The clerk read both sides and ruled that the immediate issue required further review. The postponement allowed the board to proceed. They used a delay like a lever. Back at home, the marshals set up temporary posts for a new community dock. They anchored a simple platform and left it to season like a claim. The sheriff's office parked once to check boundaries and then left. The marshals called it progress, that I called it theft with smiles, that it was not just about land anymore, that it was about the small, slow erosion of dignity, that it was about how a group convinced itself that it knew better than one life lived. They had taken the shore with polite words and planted it with consent. They believed in the righteousness of their picnic, and in the quiet between days I started to plan. When someone takes what is sacred with soft hands, I learned that the only answer that lasts is the kind that teaches them to be careful next time. That if you have ever felt the slow sting of being crowded out by people who claim to act for the greater good, hit like and subscribe. You will want to see what I did next. Summer pressed down heavy that year. The air around the lake felt thicker each day, and the water carried the scent of algae and sunscreen, that I could not enjoy it anymore. Every time I looked toward the shore, I saw the new path curling along what had once beamy fence line. That it was made of crushed stone and bordered by small shrubs that glowed gold in the evening light. People walked that path with dogs and strollers. They waved as if I had invited them, that I nodded back, because anger had become too tiring to carry in plain sight. The HOA acted confident. They spoke in newsletters about unity and progress. They wrote that the new access had improved property values. They added photos of the marshals smiling by the water and children fishing from the dock that had once been mine. That it was not just theft, that it was erasure, that I kept my documents in a small folder on the kitchen table. Every evening I opened it and studied the maps, that I highlighted boundaries and rechecked survey points. The truth did not change no matter how many times I read it. That shoreline was legally mine. They had crossed it, they had lied about it, but they had done it softly enough that nobody wanted to believe me. Then came the notice that changed everything. The new rule approved by the board stated that any homeowner found in violation of HOA property lines could have their lot reassessed. It sounded technical. In practice, it gave the board the power to fine me indefinitely while the appeal process dragged on. It was the kind of rule written in small print but loud. Intent. That was the trap. They wanted me to react. They wanted me to lose my calm and give them reason to label me unstable or aggressive. If they could make me look unreasonable, they would win the public story. So I smiled. That I signed every notice they sent and replied with polite letters acknowledging receipt. That I made sure everything I did was in writing. The HOA liked power on paper, so I gave them paper. That I knew a man named Lucas who worked at the county recorder office. He was a quiet friend of Ellen and remembered helping her when we bought the property. When I told him what was happening, he frowned and said he would check the records himself. But a week later, he called. He had found something odd. The HOA plat map they submitted when they incorporated the Lakeside Preservation Committee had a small adjustment on the eastern edge of my parcel. The line was redrawn by 2 feet on the shore side, just 2 feet, enough to claim the shoreline as communal, enough to make my fence appear encroached. Lucas sent me a copy stamped and dated. The adjustment had been filed 3 years after the HOA was created and signed by none other than Dale Hensley. The county had accepted it because no one had objected at the time. The change was small enough to slip through unnoticed, but the intent was clear. They had prepared this theft years in advance. That night I walked the boundary with a flashlight. The crickets were loud. The air smelled of pine and water. I traced the edge of the land and felt the old stakes beneath the soil. They were still there just as the surveyor had placed them long before the HOA existed. They had buried their lie over the truth, but the truth had roots. That I took photos and marked each stake with a small red flag. By morning the shoreline looked like a quiet battlefield. Red flags fluttering in the breeze. Neighbors slowed their cars when they passed. Some waved uncertainly. Others avoided eye contact. Later that day Dale called. His tone was smooth as ever. He said the flags were creating confusion and that I should remove them until the board could review the situation. That I told him the flags were there to mark what was mine. He paused. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said sometimes holding on too tight to the past makes people forget they are part of a community. It sounded like wisdom, but it felt like warning. The next week I received an invitation to a special board meeting. It said the topic was shoreline maintenance and cooperative improvement. I went because silence only helps the powerful. The meeting was held in the clubhouse. The marshals sat near the front smiling politely. The air conditioner hummed and the windows faced the lake that had once felt like mine. Dale opened with a speech about shared spaces. He used phrases like mutual benefit and collective harmony. Then he brought up what he called the ongoing boundary dispute. He gestured toward me and said that while my concerns were noted, the board had determined that the community needed consistent shoreline access. He proposed a motion to formalize the current layout as permanent. In other words, they wanted to make the theft official. When the motion passed, I did not speak. I simply nodded and left. But before I did, I placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of the original plat map, the current HOA map, and the county's stamp proving the alteration. I told them quietly that filing a false document with the county was not a policy matter. It was fraud. I left the room and let silence do the rest. By the time I reached home, the sun was low and the air smelled like rain. I sat on the porch and waited. It did not take long. Within 2 days, I received another call, this time from an HOA attorney, asking to discuss the matter privately. They wanted to settle. They wanted quiet. But I was done being quiet. Lucas helped me contact a property lawyer who specialized in title disputes. We met in a small office downtown, surrounded by stacks of maps and dusty binders. He listened carefully and smiled when I showed him the evidence. He said it was not just fraud. It was a clear violation of the state real estate code and possibly grounds for criminal investigation. He asked if I was ready to push. I said yes, but not yet. Timing mattered. For weeks I watched the HOA squirm. They sent friendly letters inviting me to events. They tried to rebuild the image of unity. The marshals waved more often. The kids avoided my yard. The air around the lake grew thick with unspoken tension. When the county finally confirmed that the map alteration was under review, Dale called me again. This time he did not sound polite. He said I was damaging the reputation of the neighborhood. I told him reputation was like water. It always finds its level. I hung up and smiled for the first time in months. They had built their power on paper. Now paper was pulling it down. What came next was not anger. It was precision. Revenge done right is not about fury. It is about patience. And I had learned patience from years of fishing on this lake. If you are still watching this story, waiting for the turn, hit like. Because the moment the water turned in my favor was closer than anyone knew. I spent nights studying county maps and public access laws. The HOA had fenced me out, but in their arrogance, they had overreached the boundary line that they used to claim the lakefront was not legal. The strip of grass between my old fence and the new one was still mine. Every inch of it. I decided my revenge would be quiet, not loud, not angry, just patient. I called a friend who worked in surveying. He came one foggy morning and helped me mark the real property line. The cold air carried the sound of the metal stake tapping into the soil. Each strike felt like justice returning. When the sun rose higher, I stood back and saw it clearly. The HOA's fence sat 2 feet into me. Land that tiny distance meant everything. It meant I had leverage, real and lawful leverage. I called the county office and submitted the documents. I requested a reinspection of property boundaries. The process would take weeks, but I was ready to wait while the paperwork moved through the system. I began preparing the second part of my plan. I would build my own fence right where the legal line stood, not to block the lake, not to trap anyone, just to mark the truth. I bought cedar panels and worked on weekends. The smell of cut wood mixed with the lake breeze. I didn't rush every nail I drove into place. Felt like reclaiming something stolen. The neighbors watched. Some whispered that I was provoking the HOA again, but I stayed calm. My revenge was not anger, it was precision. By the time my fence stood complete, it looked simple, a quiet row of wood following the true boundary, but behind its stillness was a message. The HOA had lied. They had crossed the line. Literally, the moment they realized this came one afternoon when their president drove me and stopped. She stared at my fence, then at the survey flags that ran along the grass. She didn't say a word. Days later, I received a letter demanding I remove the new fence. They claimed it violated community appearance rules. I smiled as I folded the paper. They still didn't understand that the fence was not decoration. It was a legal statement. I sent them a copy of the official survey and a note. It said simply, please refer to county property map section 12. Yours truly, the owner. The next week, county inspectors arrived. They walked the ground, measured the distance, and confirmed that my fence was inside my property. The HOA's was not. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without the weight in my chest. The crickets sang and the lake moved like glass. I didn't celebrate, I just listened to the silence that followed victory. The HOA tried to fight back. Of course, they filed a complaint, but the county ruling stood firm. The land behind my fence was mine again. Weeks passed, and slowly the rumor spread that the HOA had lost. A few neighbors even congratulated me quietly. One man said, you did what none of us could. I just nodded. I didn't want praise, I just wanted peace. But peace was not the end, it was a beginning, because now I had evidence of their illegal boundary and the misuse of community funds used to build it. I compiled every receipt, every email, every record I had kept since the first day they sent that fake eviction letter. And with a laugh, I prepared for the final act of payback, the one that would not only clear my name but expose everything they had done. It was no longer just about a fence, it was about truth being stronger than control, and I was ready to finish what they started. I waited for the right moment. They had built their small empire on comfortable assumptions and on the softness of neighbors who preferred peace to conflict. My folder of records had grown heavy with time. Receipts, photographs, stamp maps, emails, and the little notes I had scribbled after midnight were all there. Each sheet was a quiet accusation. Each page pulled a thread that led back to the boardroom and the trailer and the smiling volunteers who had planted shrubs on my soil. That I began by sending certified letters, plain statements with copies of the original plat and the altered HOA map attached. That I did not shout or threaten, that I used the language of facts and dates and verified signatures. When Dale received the envelope, he called his lawyer. When Linda read the maps, she went pale. Next, I made a single video that I walked the boundary and let the camera linger on the old stakes and the new posts. That I filmed the stone entrance where their sign reached like a claim into my land. That I narrated without fury. That I spoke clearly about dates and filings and the names of the people who had signed the altered map. That I did not add music or dramatic cuts. The quiet voice made the images feel like testimony. That I uploaded the video to a public file and sent the link to the county recorder, the local news desk, and 6 of the neighbors who had been most active in the online group. The reaction was immediate. The county scheduled a field inspection for the next week. Got a reporter from the paper texted to ask if she could come and record the inspection. A man from the local television station left a message asking for an interview. Suddenly, what had felt like a private war became a public story. They tried to contain it. Dale sent a statement to the community email list about transparency and cooperation. Linda arranged a meeting at the clubhouse with free coffee and a promise to listen. They wanted to spin the narrative back to unity and shared values, but the documents had teeth. The county inspector walked the ground and measured the distances. He compared the old stamp map with the HOA map, and his pen moved slowly across the paper, He did not look up until he had finished. The inspector filed his report the next day. It was terse and official. It stated that the HOA map had been altered without proper recorded authority. It requested immediate removal of unauthorized signage and landscaping from the disputed strip. The tone was polite, but the effect was blunt. Their foundation was showing cracks. The story hit the local feeds the next morning. Neighbors who had nodded politely on walks now stopped to ask questions. Elders who had kept their opinions to themselves told me they had seen small discrepancies for years, but had not understood the scale. The community page filled with comments and photos and demands for accountability. Some blamed me for stirring trouble. Others admitted they had not known. The marshals did not speak to me that week. Their son kept to his room. I think they were embarrassed. Dale deleted some posts and then deactivated his account for a few days. Panic is quiet at first, then it becomes a rash of hurried meetings and whispered phone calls. Their lawyer called to propose mediation. The offer sounded reasonable in tone. They wanted to avoid a lawsuit and the bad press that would follow. I agreed to mediation, but I did not go empty-handed. Harris and I walked in with a binder of invoices and a ledger that added up the cost of the entrance, the hedge, the volunteer labor, and the missed property uses over several years. We had asked an appraiser to estimate the value of the frontage for visibility and for community use. The number was not petty. It was precise. The first mediation session was tense. The board sat together at a long table like a small jury. Dale tried to look calm, but his hands betrayed him. Linda read statements about community and good intentions. I listened. When it was my turn, I laid the invoices on the table and let them speak. Harris described the alteration of records and the precedent of rectifying such errors. He used phrases that sound boring on paper, but land heavily in a room full of people who have to explain themselves to a mediator. Word leaked to the paper. The reporter asked questions about the budget and volunteer hours, and whether HOA funds had been used to alter the entrance. The financial records were murky in places. Volunteers had paid for some plants out of pocket. Checks had been written for landscaping companies without clear line items. Questions that had been easy to ignore in a casual conversation became hard to dodge in print. The board began to fracture. A few members confessed privately that they had not known about the map change. Others defended the action as a mistake in paperwork, not a theft. The marshals reached out through a mutual friend to say they did not want to hurt me and that they had been following what they were told. People wanted closure, that I wanted restitution, and a public correction. At the end of mediation, we reached a framework. They would remove the hedges and the stone sign from the disputed strip. They would publish a statement on the community page acknowledging the mistake and apologizing to me and to any others affected. They would compensate for the landscaping and pay a small sum for the years the entrance had occupied my frontage. They would also fund a community liaison position to prevent future mistakes. IT was not everything I could have demanded. IT was not vengeance. IT was consequence. IT was the law moving through a small town and asking for truth. When the board members voted, the chair counted hands slowly. Some votes were reluctant. Others were firm. In the hallway after the meeting, a few people said they were glad it was over. I said nothing. I felt something like relief, but also the steady residue of exhaustion that comes from fighting for what is right. The removal day was ordinary and strangely ceremonial. Volunteers showed up with trucks and gloves and small buckets. They dug up shrubs with quiet hands. The big stone sign was loaded on a trailer and driven away some. Neighbors stood and watched like it was a small civic event. A few clapped politely, as if this were the end of a play. The paper ran an article that quoted the county inspector and described the mediation. The comments were messy. People took sides, but the factual record was clearer than the rumor mill. The maps were public. The letters were filed. The ledger was in the county records. That night a letter arrived at my door. IT was brief. IT apologized for the oversight. IT promised better governance. IT offered a check that covered a portion of the costs and asked if I would consider donating a small amount back to a community fund. I folded the letter and set it on the table. I slept differently that night. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just quieter. There was still one final act left. One more thing I wanted them to understand. If you are watching and you believe that standing up matters, hit the like button, because the last part of the story shows what happens when consequence meets accountability. The ground felt different the morning I started building the fence. The air was still cool from the night before, and the lake was quiet. And no voices, no engines, only the sound of wind sliding through the reeds that I marked the line carefully using the original stakes, and a bright string stretched between them. It was the same line that had existed before the HOA ever placed their stone sign or planted their hedge. Now it was mine again, and it was time to make that visible. The posts went in slowly one by one. Each hole was measured, each plank leveled by hand. It was not just wood and screws. It was a boundary that said something they could not rewrite. I chose a simple design. Nothing ornamental, natural cedar that caught the morning light and turned honey-colored by noon. As the fence grew, I could feel something loosen inside me. Every board was a quiet sentence in the story they had tried to control. By midday, people began to notice that a few cars slowed as they passed. Neighbors walked down to ask what I was building. I told them it was the fence that should have been there all along. Most nodded. Some smiled. A few looked uneasy because they knew what it meant around 2 o'clock. Dale showed up. He stood on the opposite side of the line, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the new posts. He looked older than before. Maybe it was the weeks of stress, or the way truth settles heavy on a person who has tried to bend it. He did not shout or threaten. He only said he wished it had not come to this, that I told him it did not have to. Then I turned back to the fence and kept working. He stood there for a while, then walked away. When the last panel went in, I stepped back and looked at it. The fence ran straight and true from one end of my property to the other. The reflection of the board shimmered softly in the lake water. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and no arrogance, no hostility. Just a clear line between what was mine and what was theirs. That evening I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun slide down behind the trees. The fence caught the light and glowed faintly as if the day itself was approving the work. For the first time in months, the view felt peaceful again. No signs, no encroachment, no arguments. Only the quiet rhythm of water and the scent of cedar. A few days later, I got a letter from the HOA. It was brief and formal. It confirmed that the boundary had been corrected and that all records had been updated with the county. It thanked me for my cooperation and closed with a single line about rebuilding trust within a community. I smiled when I read that. Trust is not rebuilt by paper. It grows in silence and honesty and in distance when needed. Weeks passed. The Marshalls moved out before the summer ended. Their house went on the market, and someone else bought it by fall. The new owners were quiet people who waved from the driveway and asked no questions about the past. The HOA meetings grew smaller and calmer. Dale resigned from the board a few months later. Linda stayed, but she avoided eye contact for a long time. I kept my distance. I trimmed the grass along the fence and repainted the boards. Once, as the season changed, the neighborhood slowly forgot the story, though pieces of it lived on in small conversations and in the online archives of a newspaper. But I remembered everything. Not out of bitterness, but out of gratitude. Every injustice carries a lesson if you are willing to look at it without flinching. Sometimes I walked the fence at night with a flashlight just to feel the boundary under the beam of light. It was quiet work, almost like prayer. The cedar had darkened with time and smelled stronger after rain. It was a living reminder that peace does not always mean surrender. Sometimes peace means building something firm enough to hold your truth. One morning in late autumn, I saw Dale again. He was walking by himself along the path by the lake. He stopped near the fence and nodded. It was a small gesture, but it carried a kind of acceptance. We did not speak. We did not need to. The silence between us was enough. Life returned to its simple rhythm after that. The lake froze in winter and thawed in spring. The reeds came back green and tall. The fence stood through all of it, straight and steady like a quiet witness. Visitors who came by often said the place felt calm. I never told them why. I think revenge is often misunderstood. It is not always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it is about restoring balance, about taking back what was yours and letting truth breathe again, that my revenge was not in the humiliation of others, but in the restoration of peace. That fence did not just mark a boundary of land at it, marked the end of a battle and the beginning of calm. If you have ever been pushed past your limit, if you have ever watched someone twist truth to their advantage, then you know how this feels. Hold your ground, be patient, let the facts speak. Because sometimes the best payback is not a fight or a shout. Sometimes it is the quiet act of rebuilding what they tried to take. The wind picked up that evening and carried the smell of cedar across the lake. The water rippled softly, and the light danced on the fence like gold. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the stillness settle. No anger, no noise, just peace. And in that calm I realized something simple and final. Sometimes peace is the loudest revenge of all.